Hello and welcome to podcast review 6. Now, this is the first one that isn't just Fly Podcast or Performance Podcast or Barbell Life. This is Barbell Shrugged, episode 591. Anders Varner, Doug Larson, who I don't actually know who they are, and Travis Mash. So, he's the only reason I did it, Travis Mash. He's a good lad. This was thanks to Laura for sending me this podcast. This was one that sounded really interesting, and it was about a lot of it they were talking about a documentary or something that I hadn't watched, so I just skipped past that because I didn't care about that. But a large part of it was about training for power without using the Olympic lifts, and is it possible and whatnot. And they did talk about a lot of good things. So to start with, they talked about the they talked about what power is. They said, in its basic terms, it's everything that's good in sports. So someone does like a knockout punch in boxing, that requires power. Someone scores a good free kick or something that requires a lot of speed and force through the football. Similarly, weightlifting obviously requires a lot of power. They talked about the power curve being a combination of force, so strength, and velocity, so speed. And it was the speed and the force on the curve, so you got the high force on one end and low speed. So that might be something like, for example, powerlifting, which is obviously incredibly high force but done at very slow rates, still develops power. They're gonna have some level of power. Similarly, people who are unbelievably fast but with kind of lower strength levels, so you might think of someone like possibly a boxer in terms of a max punch is going to be done with much less force because there's basically no resistance, until they get hit. And that force is only applied really by the puncher, and it's not against an external resistance of, say, a barbell in powerlifting. So that's high velocity, low force. And then right in the middle are things like, in my opinion, sprinting, where you have a huge ground reaction force of up to kind of 4 times body weight, which is why it makes it unparalleled in power. There's nothing you can do in the gym to replicate that really, other than sprinting, and it's done at such high velocities. So we're talking upwards of potentially elite level, kind of 10 meters per second, for bad sprinters, it's kind of 8 meters per second. And then Olympic weightlifting, so lifting heavy weights or sub-maximal weights, but heavy for the lifts they are, but they're sub-maximal weights done really fast, so they're snatch and a clean jerk, and that is really useful, and that is why weightlifting and sprinting, for example, are such good developers of power. They talked a bit about titin, which we probably know about myosin and actin, which are kind of filaments in a muscle which cause muscle contraction. They kind of hook onto each other and pull. But titin kind of holds them together. It holds the joints together. So it holds actin and myosin together, and it allows for elasticity. So that's why training things like plyometrics, which use this kind of stretch shortening cycle and elastic energy, is again unparalleled. You can't really. There's not a huge stretch shortening cycle kind of component in weightlifting, for example. Now, probably the jerk is probably the one example of using the stretch shortening cycle, but even then it's at a slower velocity than a lot of other jumps. So if you can imagine a max long jump at the elite level versus the jerk at the elite level, they're both unbelievably fast, but the long jump, as soon as he lands on the board, that flexion to extension is going to be way quicker than the jerk. So that was interesting. Now, they did talk a lot about sprinting and kind of why at max velocity, there's more hamstring issues. Now, this is because a lot of hamstring tears and hamstring pulls happen when you land on the ground at touchdown in the max velocity stride phase. when you're accelerating, because it's a little bit more hip flexion dominant, the hamstring is never fully stretched. That's why there's no real issues there. The hamstring eccentrically extends really quick, obviously rapidly. If you can imagine a right foot hits the ground and the right foot paws up, the heel comes close to the butt and then cycles around, it will eccentrically extend really quickly. It reaches its end point at kind of just past full hip extension, and then the glutes kind of pull the hip even further into hyperextension. Hamstrings kind of only really go to neutral, they found. And then, so obviously it's at its end range, and then it obviously gets pulled even further. So it has to be very mobile. It has to be very actively mobile. But also, when it lands, like I said, there's about 4 times body weight of force going through that hamstring. And if it's already unbelievably stretched, then that's when, if it's not conditioned, that's when injuries occur. So now I've never ever had a hamstring injury sprinting. I sprinted for 6 years at a relatively high level, obviously not elite level, but training to win, training to compete, training to win, and never had a hamstring issue. So if you're not stupid with if you use your common sense, you'll be fine. If you're 40, 30, and even then, if you're that old, if you're just untrained and you just start sprinting, then good luck, mate. Good luck. See you on the other side. Well, I just won't talk to you because it's just ridiculous. It shows your ignorance. Thinking about squeezing the knee, it's quite a good cue they use about squeezing the back of the knee if I show you my leg. If you're running in a cycle, squeeze the knee up and then come down. So if you go squeeze the knee in there, obviously that's where squeeze and contact on the ground, rather than lifting up with a psoas or pulling up with the hip flexion. Hamstrings and glutes are a lot stronger than the psoas, for example. So the hip extenders are usually a lot stronger than the hip flexors. Now that's not to say hip flexors aren't needed, they obviously are. But yeah, and then they talked a lot about using things like French contrast training, which I've talked a lot about. They talked a lot about power exercises and why jumps and throws specifically, are one of the most underutilized power exercises. And it's absolutely right. Again, we know with throws, if I'm throwing something against the wall, I can extend aggressively throughout the full range of motion, all the way kind of basically past extension. I don't need to break. If I do that with, say, for example, a jerk, if I keep punching, I'm going to pull my shoulder up my socket at some point. I have to lock it in at some point. Similarly with the bench press, if I'm here, I can't press up to here and then keep pressing up with the weight. I can't be kind of here, because that will pull me forward and destroy my shoulders. I can only press aggressively to kind of here, and then I've got to slow down and break. Whereas if I've got a throw, I let go of the implement, I can follow through, I can fully extend through the whole range of motion. That's why power development for things like jumps and throws is doable, very doable. And that's the one thing that kind of weightlifting doesn't have. You do get it a little bit in the triple extension, but at some point you have to break, which I guess is good for some. It's context dependent, but they talked a lot about why throws are good, pairing it with bench press and whatnot, basic contrast and complex training. They did also talk about something that was really interesting, was that everyone does, for power, extension-based exercises. Squat jump, where you're jumping up, full extension. Throwing into full extension. Bench press throw, catch and throw up into extension. Why does no one do flexion-based power exercises? For example, med ball slam, throwing down into a kind of a crumpled ball, kind of into a ball. They actually talked about doing toes to bar or high-end leg raises explosively. Now, that sounds kind of ridiculous, but if you can get a hip flexion power exercise, there's probably the single best carryover to sprinting there is. and jumping and pretty much any sports skill ever. I would say possibly the one caveat to that is I thought initially at first then probably weightlifters probably wouldn't have a need for that, but then I'm forgetting about the turnover and the catch, and obviously you do need to get into triple flexion very quickly and after triple extension. So that's why things like box jumps are actually very useful. You have to fully extend, but then you have to very quickly triple flex. And that mimics the kind of extension of the clean into the bottom of the squat or bottom of the snatch. But then many other sports like, wrestling, like MMA, like combat style sports, I guess rugby, if you're pulling someone into a ruck, for example, a lot of it is pulling down or flexing down. And then I guess even like a knee, I don't know what it's called, but like a knee kick, in MMA, I gonna assume that you can kind of, I know there are knee attacks where you can extend the knee out in front of you and sit back, but I'm assuming there's also, or like hooks, for example, where you kind of come around and you're more flexed in. I mean, for combat sports, I can't think of any other examples, but combat sports, that seems very useful to do flexion-based power exercises. Let me quick think of another example. Not off the top of my head. But then they also talk about rotational as well. Now, obviously, that comes into play like racket sports or golf, tennis, badminton, squash, table tennis, where you have to be powerful but in rotation. And obviously, we can use things like med ball throws. We can even use rotational jumps. And that's why, and that's the final part about throws and why they're so good, is that you can do them in any direction. Extension, flexion, rotation, everything in between. And that's the thing that weightlifting doesn't have. So I think a lot of times in S&C, people think that because in the research, weightlifters outperform most other athletes in every kind of power variable. That's because they only really test things like standing vertical jump or broad jump, which is very one-dimensional, which has led people to think that weightlifting is the be-all and end-all. And as a weightlifter and a weightlifting coach, I do love weightlifting. I think it's very, very useful. I've not trained anyone who hasn't got better at weightlifting and then got less powerful as a result. But most people's argument were that it's not necessary, which I agree with. It's absolutely not. For example, Devontae's sprint times have gone through the roof this season. Or should I say down? Which is good. And he's not done any weightlifting, Olympic weightlifting. And they were talking about, now I don't really agree with this, they were talking about the time commitment to teaching someone isn't worth it. They used an NFL example, right? Fair enough. If you're in an elite sports team, fair enough. If you're, I'm probably going to leave the video at this. If you're hearing from an S&C coach that they don't want you to learn Olympic weightlifting because it's not worth the time, they're not a great coach. They do not understand variations in weightlifting movements and dumbing it down and making simpler exercise. Like, fair enough, I would probably never coach someone who wasn't a weightlifter a full snatch, but I sure as hell could give them a hip power snatch, which I could teach anyone in about 5 minutes. So I think people who say things like weightlifting isn't worth the time, they are not only not confident at teaching weightlifting at all and probably don't understand the sport at all, they also don't realise that weightlifting derivatives can be used. That being said, I do fully agree that it's not needed. I think everyone can benefit from it unless you're majorly injured in some way, like catastrophically injured. It's not necessary though, as evidenced by, a lot of research, anecdotal evidence as well from myself. So when I went home in first lockdown, I didn't do any weightlifting, just plyometrics and sprints, and my power measurements for broad jump and vertical jump went through the roof. So there's a lot of different ways. What do they say? There's loads of different ways to skin the cat, or there's loads of different ways to cook the sausage. Is what I would say. You can grill it, you can fry it, bake it, you can have it raw. Thank you.